All right. Now, in this module, we are going to be addressing the question of whether or not food can count as art. So, in this series of lectures, that's the main issue, the main question that we're addressing. But before I can even begin to engage in that question, it's actually necessary for me to explain some of the terms and ideas that we're going to be using throughout the lecture. Specifically, I need to get clear about what we mean regarding this term aesthetics, or maybe another way of putting this is aesthetic experience. Well, in philosophy, aesthetics is the study of the nature of art, the nature of beauty, of taste, and more broadly speaking, it involves our experiences, right? These sensory sort of aspects of our everyday go of things, especially as it relates to what we might call the beautiful or the beautiful object. So let's define, for our purposes right now, aesthetic experience as it's traditionally been understood, at least. We can say that aesthetics is an experience in which we perceive, attend to, appreciate the sensory or formal qualities of an object or an event or a phenomenon of some sort, often in very reflective ways and in a manner that goes beyond mere practical or bodily usefulness. So, and in other words, we can say that when we engage with something for its beauty or for its harmony or expressive qualities, rather than merely for things like survival or utility or even the immediate, gratification or pleasure that we get from it. So let me try to spell that out in a bit more detail here. We can say that aesthetic experience is generally taken to be an experience that engages us in a particular way. For instance, it's appreciative rather than merely practical. So when I look at a painting or I'm listening to some piece of music or maybe I'm attending the symphony, I'm not doing so merely to survive or to eat or to make money. I'm taking it in for its own sake. There's something special or unique about doing this, about going through this experience. Secondly, it's evaluative, right? I'm not just experiencing it as a mere passive agent. Rather, I'm engaging with it. I'm judging it in some sense. I'm noticing its qualities, the balance, the form, the harmony, the expression that's involved. And then third, generally we might say that it's a kind of shared or communicable activity or experience. Various philosophers, for instance, people like Kant or Hume, they emphasize that aesthetic judgments are not purely subjective, right? So this goes against the idea of saying that, art is in the eyes of the beholder, right? Because for them, art carries a claim that others should be able to appreciate the same object in similar ways. This is especially the case for Kant, who claims that an object of beauty is something that kind of merits a very specific reaction in others. It's a higher form of experience, other than something that's merely personable or subjective in its form. So when we contrast that with ordinary pleasures like eating a snack or listening to music while you're driving down the road, these things may give us different levels of enjoyment. So yes, we can get pleasure from it, but it's not immediately clear that these things will count as aesthetic in this very specific sort of traditional way of understanding art. Rather, these experiences both seem to engage in our perception and reflection, right? Art experiences involve these aspects of perception and reflection, where we attend to qualities that give it sort of rich form, some sort of an expressive power. That we are aware of, right? We're able to recognize these qualities, and others are able to recognize them as well. Right. So when we are asking whether or not food itself is going to count as art, we're essentially asking the following questions. Can these things rise to the level of some kind of reflective, evaluative, and communicable engagement? Right. Another question that this raises is whether food can elicit appreciation in ways that merits the criteria of different aesthetic experiences, not merely bodily pleasure or some sort of agreeableness, something that makes me feel good or that I feel subjectively, but is it something that could be reasonably recognized by others and shared in a valuable way, the same way that a painting or a symphony or a sculpture might? Now, I do want to admit that I come from a background in fine arts, specifically photography. So, I do kind of share this sort of more general, classical way of thinking about art, if you will. So I should say, cards on the table. When I first started thinking about these issues, I did find myself siding with those who would traditionally exclude food as being a genuine form of art. And maybe you would too. Maybe you would also for similar sorts of reasons. Yet at the same point, I would find myself as thinking, music. Music is certainly a form of art. And so it's not immediately obvious that listening to your favorite band, like if I were to listen to a Pearl Jam record on the road while I'm driving across country or something, that seems to be a genuine form of aesthetic experience. And so I find myself torn in two different directions here, which I think is one reason why I find this particular topic quite interesting. So maybe you also would, feel the same sort of way as I do here. And so I want you to kind of keep those things in your mind as we continue to examine some of the complications and nuances that are involved in this topic. But what I want to do first is I want to turn to what Pollan has to say about pleasure. So before we get into any of the other details, I think it's important to, pay attention to some of the points that Pollan makes in his book In Defense of Food. In the earlier chapters, he actually says quite a bit about nutrients and some of the issues that are involved in what he calls nutritionism. And I think it's important to pay attention to that as kind of background to help explain what's going on in chapter 7 of Pollan's book, where he talks about, thinking about pleasure and what kind of pleasure food brings. So remember that in the opening chapters of Pollan's book, he describes how there's this kind of major cultural shift that occurred in the 20th century, where we, generally speaking, as a public, we stopped talking about foods and rather we started talking about things like nutrients. So we stopped thinking of food in terms of, I don't know, like apples or bread or eggs or milk or steak or whatever. And instead we started thinking about things in terms of carbs, proteins, fats, fibers, cholesterol, and so on. Now, Pollan calls this a particular kind of ideology, a very specific sort of approach or view of food. He labels this nutritionism. So, and we've talked about this in the past. But the key idea of nutritionism is just that the real value of food lies in these so-called invisible nutrients that are, I guess, supposed to exist in some sense inside the food itself. They're like little properties or substances inside the food. But here's the thing, it actually turns out to be the case that many of these so called nutrients aren't actually in the food in the way that we tend to imagine them. Take, for instance, something like a calorie. We often talk as if calories are little substances that are contained inside the food, like a kind of a little packet of energy that might be inside a cookie. But it turns out that calories actually aren't little packets of energy at all, right? A calorie is a unit of measurement. What a calorie does is it measures how much energy a certain food releases when it's burned by the human body. In fact, the calorie count of a food is often actually determined in a laboratory, and it's determined by literally burning in a device called the calorimeter, which measures the energy that's released by that food. So what that means is if we say something like, the cookie has 20 calories, what we're really saying is that it actually releases a certain amount of energy when burned, not that there's 20 little things, these invisible calories that are hidden inside of it. So already you can see how this is a weird way of thinking about food when we're thinking of it strictly in terms of these invisible nutrients. Now, remember, Pollan calls to our attention two different key assumptions that he thinks are largely made by proponents of nutritionism, folks that are in the business of, making government regulations or trying to tell the public what a good, healthy diet is, but more specifically, a part of the food industry in a capitalistic society, right? So he thinks that there's these two assumptions that are important and that we should pay attention to. Of course, he rejects both of them, but we'll say a bit more about that in a second. So the first assumption just simply says that all we need to know about food, the only thing we need to understand about food, the food that we eat, is the nutrients or the chemical components that make up that food, right? The second assumption is that the whole point of food is simply to promote good health. All right, so I want to address these two assumptions here briefly. Let me begin with the second assumption, right? The assumption that says the whole point or purpose of food is to promote good health. That assumption seems weird. Pollan rejects it, but I think that we can actually say a little bit more about why it's actually a very weird assumption. Honestly, when you think about it, the assumption seems a little ridiculous. I think a helpful comparison to this is something like sex, right? Think about the way that sex has been viewed in various different religious traditions. For instance, in the Roman Catholic tradition, there's this theologian named St. Thomas Aquinas. He was a medieval Catholic theologian who insisted that the primary purpose of sex was procreation, right? Simply to produce more babies. And from that point of view, if sex doesn't lead to reproduction, then it's in some sense missing the point. It's missing its purpose, its function. But of course, you might think that just simply flies in the face of our ordinary experience of human existence, of the way we experience the world. We know that sex has many different purposes. For instance, it can be pleasurable, it can promote intimacy, bonding, and love. It's not merely just about reproduction or procreation. In fact, there's many people that cannot procreate at all. And so that would seem to suggest that sex has no purpose for them. And that just seems ridiculous. That seems very strange. So insisting that sex is only for the purpose of procreation misses the point, right? It makes a meaningful error insofar as it fails to tell us something really valuable about human existence, about the human experience, namely that sex is not merely for procreation. Now, Poland, I think, is saying something similar about food here, right? To say that food is only to promote good health is to ignore many other important roles that food actually plays in our life, right? Specifically, food gives us pleasure, and we should pay attention to that. Right? It brings people together in important ways. It helps share different cultural identities, promote ritual and meaning and bonding, of course, food is about health, right? It's not as if health doesn't matter at all, but it's not only about health, right? That's not its sufficient condition for what food is, what makes food meaningful. So to reduce food to, having some purpose of giving us good health, which seems to be at the core of nutritionism, seems to miss the main significance of that food plays in human life. Now, what about that first assumption? Why would Pollen reject the claim that all we even really need to know about food is the nutrients that are inside it? Well, one point, as I mentioned a minute ago, was that these ideas, these notions of nutrients, these invisible things inside the food, aren't necessarily straightforwardly in the food in the first place. Right. More importantly, though, even if we can identify some sort of nutrients, and that knowledge of the nutrients helps us in some regard, that doesn't tell the full story. Right. Foods are enormously complex. Scientists are still discovering all sorts of different chemical compounds in the food, right? And so pollen is reminding us that there's thousands of different, chemicals that are inside, for instance, plants that play an important role in human health. And they're largely unknown to us, actually. Right. So we need to focus on more than just merely these, invisible nutrients that we have identified. Otherwise, we're going to miss the whole point of why food matters. And I think this actually does a nice job of tying directly into what we talked about last week regarding the epistemology of food. Right. Remember that the discussion we engaged in last week suggested that we can't really know what actually we're eating, and that this is a problem because putting different foods into our body is a risky behavior. So then the problem with this shift that Pollen is identifying, where we're focusing on different nutrients in foods rather than the food itself, is that it leaves ordinary eaters, people like you and me who are not experts, it leaves us dependent upon experts. Since we can't see these invisible nutrients, we have to trust whatever the scientists say, whatever the government recommends, or perhaps whatever the food industry happens to tell us is good or bad. And those expert verdicts, well, they're a little bit unstable, right? We can't necessarily depend upon them, especially when they're engaging in things like bullshit, right? So, things like fat, right? It was originally told to us that things like fat were the villain, right? That the modern diet is problematic because there's too much fat in it. Well, and then they said, well, it's actually the carbs. The carbs are the villain. That's what makes the modern diet so problematic. And now they're saying that it's sugar and so on. I do want to mention, however, that sugar, for instance, is a big issue, right? I think that especially US citizens are consuming far too much sugar. But sugar alone is not the problem, right? So when we focus on just one of these aspects rather than having a holistic approach, that seems to be the main issue. So while we are becoming more and more reliant on different food experts, in the meantime, things like food processing gets marketed as healthy just simply by adding or subtracting different nutrients depending upon what the food happens to be. Likewise, we can see how this actually corresponds really nicely with what Placius argued regarding our knowledge of food, insofar as our knowledge of food is deeply limited. And this is especially the case in a capitalist society where labels are often misleading, right? Remember that Placius drew on Frankfurt's idea of bullshit, where this is actually a technical philosophical term, right? According to Frankfurt's notion of bullshit, this is, this idea that we don't really care about whether something is true or false, whether the claims we're making actually are true or whether they're false, right? We're not interested in deceiving people. Rather, these companies are interested in marketing foods using labels, labels that might sound very scientific or very healthy in different ways, simply because it helps, promote or sell the item, sell the food, right? So without any actual regard for whether those labels are saying something true or useful or false, right? If that's right, then even our supposed like so-called nutritional knowledge is oftentimes more confusing than clear. So rejecting this first assumption that the most important thing that we need to know about food is simply the nutrients that are inside the food, well, that seems problematic. That seems false, right? Food is more than the nutrients that we happen to isolate, name, and the so-called access that we have to the information, right? That's all riddled with uncertainty and manipulation. Insofar as the food industry is engaged in this kind of bullshit, where it's more important to sell the item than it is to inform the public of what's in the item. But what I want to do this week, right, for this specific module, is to talk about the aesthetics of food, which is arguably overlooked in a number of important and crucial ways in our everyday go of things. And that brings us to the chapter in the defense of food called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Notice that for Pollan, this shift to focus on nutritionism is problematic for a number of reasons, but it also sidelines something very important, something fundamental, which is the pleasure of eating. So when we begin discussing our own senses, our own cultural traditions, we may start to think that if something tastes good, if we get pleasure from it, then it's a bad thing for us. But in chapter 7, Pollan pushes back against this, right? Pollan encourages us to take pleasure in food, right? He pushes back against this suspicion that pleasure is a sign of something problematic or bad. Rather, pleasure that we get from food helps guide us, right? It's the pleasure that we get from food that gives us a way to think through some of these issues. And he traces the suspicion that pleasure is bad back to various religious and philosophical traditions. For instance, the Puritans, right? They had this kind of distrust of anything that was associated with bodily enjoyment or any kind of carnal, physical pleasure. But even philosophers like Plato, dating back thousands of years to the Greeks, Plato is a very important and very influential philosopher. But even Plato worried that our senses could not really give us true information. And finding pleasure in the physical world around us would easily lead us astray, and so we should not trust our physical, connection to reality in that way. And even in modern times, different medical and dietary advice oftentimes carries this sort of suspicion where the idea is that feeling good must be unhealthy. Finding pleasure in our experience is in some sense sinful or evil or bad. So for Pollan, it's this notion of nutritionism that he's been focusing on in the earlier chapters that he thinks is a direct heir to the traditions that sees pleasurable experiences as being, in some sense, the core of the problem. So here's what I think is the key point or takeaway for this particular chapter. I think what Pollan is doing is he's arguing that pleasure, the pleasure we get from eating, can actually be a good guide to good health. It's not the enemy of health, and it's a mistake to classify it that way. In fact, I think we can think about this from an evolutionary standpoint too. Our senses did not evolve simply to betray us, right? Our sensory experiences are based upon, our perceptual organs, and these have evolved to help us survive. Right, our palates and our appetites are capable of recognizing nutrition, wholesome foods, that is, as long as they're not being distorted in some specific way by the food industry and by different additives that are designed to, in a sense, hijack those basic evolutionary instincts that we have kind of pre-programmed in us. Now, Pollan also brings to light the different cultural aspects that are involved in the pleasure of food. For instance, there's places like in France or in Italy where people take pleasure in eating very seriously, right? I think that this is a huge issue and it makes a lot of sense. And interestingly, the public health outcomes in these countries are oftentimes much better than what we find in the US, despite diets that are rich in, a lot of fats, a lot of cheeses, a lot of wines, right? So Pollan is trying to, bring to our attention what's sometimes called the French paradox. So this is kind of just the basic idea that suggests that pleasure, when structured by other sorts of cultural traditions, actually works in harmony with health rather than against health. Right. So the French paradox is this idea where people eat a lot of fat, a lot of things that we might consider harmful for us, bad for our health. They eat lots of these things, but the people living in those cultures and those societies oftentimes are much healthier than what we find in places like the US. So Pollan's main contention at this point is just that instead of fearing the pleasure that we often get from eating, we should reclaim it. We should embrace the pleasure we get from eating. We should be more open to the idea that pleasure itself, in and of itself, is not wrong or sinful or, in some sense, the problem or the enemy. And once we do that, then we can, I think, start to relearn how to cultivate food in a pleasurable way. And to do so wisely through mindful eating, through the support of different cultural traditions, rather than letting the food industry, simply manipulate our senses with processed, engineered to be craveable kinds of products. All right, so here's why I think all of this is so important, why I think it's key to begin with this chapter that we get from Pollan. Pollan's defense of food as a pleasurable experience naturally leads us to the philosophical question of aesthetics. If the pleasure that we get from food is to count as legitimate, if it can be wise, if it's not merely indulgent, then the next question I think that arises is, can we think of food as an object of aesthetic appreciation, of aesthetic experience in some, meaningful sense, in a way that would put it on par with things like painting or music or great literature? Now, this is the debate that Placius takes up in chapter 3 of the book, Thinking Through Food. And we're going to turn to what she says in that chapter and the following video lectures. But given that Pollan has, I think, done a nice job of showing us that food can be pleasurable and how that is actually important, I think it's worth considering what Placius goes on to suggest about the pleasure that we get from art, more generally speaking. That's the question of, if aesthetic experience in something like a great meal, can that be comparable to the aesthetic experience that you might get from going to a symphony? Or is food, in some particular sense, considered to be lesser because it's tied up with things like various bodily needs or mere survival, these lesser aspects of human existence? So that's what we will turn to in the next lecture.